The final nail in the coffin of her old life was not a nail at all, but the sharp, decisive click of a latch. Elias, her late husband's brother, closed the door to the small cottage she had shared with Thomas, and the sound was as final as a shovelful of dirt on a casket. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, as if she were already a ghost he was refusing to see. "The law is the law, Elara," he said, his voice flat and stripped of any warmth. "Thomas had debts, the cottage, the land. It all goes to settle them. It's out of my hands." He turned his pockets inside out, a gesture of hollow finality, and produced a handful of coins. They were dull and worn, smelling of sweat and metal. He pressed them into her palm, their coldness a shock against her skin. "This is what's left from the sale of the furniture. $27. She stared at the coins, her hand a cup of useless silver. $27 and the clothes on her back. That was the sum of her life, with the man she had loved, the man who had promised her a future in the burgeoning town of Silver Creek. Now he was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley like a phantom thief, and his family was sweeping away what little remained. Elias cleared his throat, a dry, uncomfortable sound. "There is one other thing. The deed." He produced a folded, yellowed piece of paper from his coat. "It was Thomas's grandfather's folly. No one ever wanted it. It's outside the debt, worthless on the books, so it's yours." He handed it to her, and she unfolded it. The paper was brittle, the ink faded. It described a plot of land 5 miles north of town, a place everyone knew. They called it the Scab. It was a barren, rocky hillside, a wound on the landscape where nothing grew but stunted, wind-scoured pines and bitter weeds. It was a place of last resort, a punchline to a cruel joke. A few townsfolk had gathered at a respectable distance, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, stood with his arms crossed, his expression one of grim assessment. Sarah Finch, whose husband had been one of Thomas's pallbearers, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though Elara knew the tears were more for the spectacle than for her sorrow. They saw a widow, cast out and destitute, clutching a worthless deed. They saw a woman doomed. "You can take a room at the boarding house for a time," Elias offered, the words heavy with obligation. "The church can help after that. No one will see you starve." His offer was a cage disguised as charity, a life of dependence and whispered judgments, a life as poor widow Elara. Elara looked from Elias's averted face to the watching town, and then down at the deed in her hand. A cold resolve began to form in the pit of her stomach, pushing aside the grief and the shock. It was a small, hard kernel of defiance. She would not be their charity case. She would not be their cautionary tale. She folded the deed carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She turned her back on the cottage, on the life that was no longer hers, and walked toward the center of town. The coins felt heavy in her hand. She did not go to the boarding house. She went to Mr. Gable's mercantile. The bell above the door chimed, announcing her arrival. The store was warm and smelled of cinnamon, coffee, and cured leather. Mr. Gable followed her in, his expression softening into professional pity. "Elara," he began, his voice low, "a terrible business, truly terrible, if you need anything on credit." "I have money," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. She laid the coins on the counter. "I need an axe, a good one, and a whetstone." Mr. Gable blinked, surprised. "An axe?" "And a shovel, and 10 pounds of salted pork, 50 pounds of flour, and a box of matches, and whatever seeds you have that will keep until spring." His professional sympathy curdled into confusion, then into the same grim certainty she had seen in Elias's eyes. He saw her folly. "Elara, that land, it's solid rock. Nothing has ever grown on the scab. You'd be throwing good money away. Take the room at the boarding house. It's the sensible thing." "This is what I need," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. He sighed, the sound of a man who had given his warning and could now proceed with a clear conscience. He selected a felling axe with a straight hickory handle, a sturdy spade, and packed the provisions into canvas sacks. He counted out her coins, leaving her with just $3. As she shouldered the heavy load, he shook his head. "The Lord looks after fools and orphans, Elara. I pray he has an eye on you." She did not answer. She walked out of the store, past the staring faces, and did not look back. She turned north, toward the barren hill that was now her only inheritance. She turned her back on Silver Creek and walked toward the wilderness, one foot in front of the other, the weight of the axe a solid, reassuring presence against her shoulder. The journey was a punishment. The 5 miles stretched into an eternity, each step a small war against the weight on her back and the cold in her heart. The well-worn track leading out of Silver Creek soon dwindled to a game trail, and then to nothing at all. The landscape grew harsher, the gentle slopes of the valley giving way to jagged rock and thorny brush. The wind picked up, a relentless, whining thing that seemed to mock her progress, pulling at her shawl and chilling her to the bone. She walked until the sun was low in the sky, painting the western peaks in brutal shades of orange and purple. Finally, she saw it. The scab rose from the earth like a diseased bone, a pale gray expanse of granite and shale that shed the last of the day's light. It was worse than the stories. It was a monument to failure, a place where life had tried and given up. There were no gentle contours, no promising patches of soil, just rock, sharp and unforgiving, littered with the corpses of twisted, skeletal pines. She dropped her sacks at the base of the hill, her muscles screaming in protest. The axe slid from her shoulder and thudded to the ground. She stood there, breathing hard, the cold air burning her lungs. This was it. This was her inheritance. This was the foundation upon which she was supposed to build a life. A wave of despair so profound it was physical washed over her. Her knees felt weak, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Mr. Gable was right. Elias was right. The whole town was right. She was a fool. She had traded a life of pitiful charity for a death of pitiful solitude. The wind howled around her, a chorus of mockery. For a long, silent moment, she stood on the edge of surrender, the thought of turning back, of begging for a place at the boarding house, a tempting whisper in her mind. Then, a stronger gust of wind, armed with icy needles of sleet, slammed into her. It was a physical blow. Instinctively, she stumbled toward the hillside, seeking any kind of shelter. She saw a dark slash in the rock face, a deep fissure maybe 10 feet high and 4 feet wide, almost like a doorway carved by some forgotten giant. She scrambled inside, pressing herself back into the narrow opening. The wind's roar was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant moan. The air inside the fissure was utterly still. But that was not what made her hold her breath. It was something else. A feeling. The rock at her back was not cold. It was not the biting, soul-leeching cold of the wind-blasted stone outside. It was cool, but a neutral, cellar-like cool, free of any frost. And beneath that coolness, there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible current of warmth. It was so subtle, she thought she might be imagining it, a desperate fantasy born of her misery. She pressed her palms flat against the stone wall deep inside the crevice. It was undeniable, a steady, gentle warmth seeped from the very heart of the mountain. It was not hot, but it was alive. Geothermal heat, a hidden pulse of life deep within the dead rock. Her gaze followed the crack upwards. It narrowed as it went, but it seemed to continue deep into the hillside. Then she heard it, a sound she had mistaken for the wind, a slow, rhythmic drip. Drip, drip, drip. Looking down, she saw a dark patch of moisture on the stone floor. Water was seeping from a hairline fracture in the rock, collecting in a small, clear puddle before vanishing into the ground. It was clean. It was constant. Section. She stood there in the quiet dark of the fissure, the world shrinking to the three sensations that would change everything. The utter stillness of the air, protected from the punishing wind. The impossible, life-giving warmth radiating from the stone. The steady, patient sound of water. The town saw a worthless scab of rock, but they had only looked at the surface. They had not seen the secret it held within. The despair did not vanish, but it retreated, beaten back by the first tendrils of a fierce, grim hope. This was not a grave. It was a shelter, waiting to be built. The first day was a lesson in pain. Ilara's hands, accustomed to needlework and kneading dough, were soft and unready for the brutal reality of the axe. She chose a dead, standing pine, its wood hardened by years of wind and sun. The first swing of the axe jarred her from her shoulders to her teeth. The blade bit only shallowly into the wood. The second and third swings were no better. Sweat stung her eyes, and her arms began to tremble with effort. But she did not stop. She swung the axe with a desperate rhythm, the grunts of exertion torn from her throat. It took her hours to fell the small tree, and when it finally crashed to the ground, she sank to her knees, her hands raw and screaming. That night, she built a small fire near the mouth of the fissure and ate a piece of salted pork, chewing it slowly, feeling the grease and salt restore a little of her strength. She slept wrapped in her shawl, her body aching, pressed against the faintly warm rock of her new home. The next day, she began the real work. The fissure was a natural starting point, providing 3 walls and a roof of solid stone. She needed to build a 4th wall to enclose it, to turn a crack in the rock into a room. She used the felled pines, slowly and clumsily trimming the branches and cutting the trunks into manageable lengths. The labor was agonizing. Blisters rose on her palms, broke and bled. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat and kept working. Her muscles burned with a fire that never went out, a constant, screaming protest against the unaccustomed toil. She needed stone for the foundation and for the fireplace she envisioned. She used the shovel and her bare, battered hands to dig and pry loose chunks of shale and granite from the hillside. She hauled them one by one, her back straining, her legs shaking. Each stone laid was a victory. She found a deposit of dense, red clay near the base of the hill where water pooled, and she knew it could be used for mortar. She spent a full day digging the clay, mixing it with water and dry grass in a hollowed-out rock, pounding it with her feet until it had the consistency of thick dough. Slowly, painstakingly, a wall began to rise. It was a crude thing, a mosaic of irregular stones and rough-hewn logs, the gaps sealed with thick gobs of her red mortar. It was not pretty, but it was solid. Each day her world consisted only of the bite of the axe, the weight of stone, the thick smell of wet clay, and the deep, numbing exhaustion that claimed her at nightfall. There were failures. A section of wall collapsed, and she had to rebuild it, stone by agonizing stone. A log slipped, crushing her hand and forcing her to stop for 2 days, weeping in frustration as she waited for the swelling to go down. As the front wall rose, she began to build the internal systems that would mean the difference between survival and death. For heat, she constructed a small, deep fireplace against the stone side of the fissure near the front. She found a narrow, vertical crack in the rock above it, and spent a week carefully widening it with a smaller stone and a piece of sharpened wood, creating a natural chimney that would draw the smoke up and away. The massive stone walls of the fissure itself would act as a thermal battery, absorbing the heat from the fire and the geothermal warmth from the earth, and radiating it back into the room long after the flames died down. For water, she turned her attention to the steady drip from the rock. She spent 4 days digging a pit in the stone floor, a cistern about 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep. The work was brutal, chipping away at the rock with the sharp edge of another stone. When the pit was dug, she lined it meticulously with a thick layer of her clay mortar, packing it down until it was smooth and waterproof. The slow, patient drip began to fill her small reservoir. It was a sound that meant life. The most ambitious system was for food. She knew she could not survive on flour and salted pork alone. Inside the deep, protected space of the fissure, where the geothermal warmth was most constant, she planned her garden. She hauled baskets of the richer soil she'd found on the lower slopes, a back-breaking journey she made dozens of times. She mixed it with dried leaves and pine needles to create a dark, fertile loam. In this manufactured earth, she built 2 long, raised garden beds, walled in with flat stones. Here, protected from the wind and frost, warmed by the earth itself, she would grow her food. After a month of relentless labor, she knew she needed more. She needed livestock. She needed more supplies. She needed to return to Silver Creek. She left her half-finished shelter, hiding her tools deep within the fissure, and made the long walk back to town. Her appearance caused a stir. She was thinner, her face weathered by sun and wind, her hands calloused and scarred. The fine dress she had left in was tattered and stained with dirt and clay. When she walked into Gable's Mercantile, a hush fell over the customers. "I need to buy 2 laying hens," she said, placing her last $3 on the counter, "and some seed potatoes, carrots, and kale, and a bag of salt." Mr. Gable stared at her hands, then at her face. He saw not a woman on the verge of starvation, but one possessed of a terrifying, incomprehensible determination. He took her money without a word of warning this time. Her brother-in-law, Elias, was in the store. He watched her, his face a mask of disbelief and scorn. "Chickens?" he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Are you going to teach them to roost on bare rock, Elara? Or perhaps they'll learn to peck for granite?" A few men chuckled. Elara ignored him. She paid for her goods, including a small crate for the hens. She loaded her new supplies and her precious livestock onto her back and walked out of the store, the sound of their quiet laughter following her. The journey back was even harder, burdened by the clucking, frightened hens and the bulky sack of potatoes. She felt 1,000 miles from the woman who had left this town in shame. She was no longer just a widow. She was a builder. A few days after her return, as she was chinking the last gaps in her wall with a mixture of clay and moss, she saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the woods. It was a dog, a gaunt, yellow-furred creature with ribs like barrel staves and wary, intelligent eyes. It watched her from a distance, too frightened to come closer, too hungry to leave. That night, Elara left out a small piece of salted pork. The next morning, it was gone. She did it again the next night, leaving the food a little closer to her shelter. This continued for a week. Finally, one evening, as a cold rain began to fall, the dog crept to the entrance of her unfinished home. It whined softly, shivering. Elara said nothing. She simply pushed the heavy, hide-covered plank that served as her temporary door a little further open. The dog hesitated, then limped inside and collapsed by the warm stones of the hearth. She named him Stone. He never left her side again. With the front wall complete and a proper wooden door hung on leather hinges, Ilara's world began to shrink in the best possible way. The days grew shorter, the wind colder, but inside her stone and log shelter, a different reality took hold. The town of Silver Creek, with its mockery and its pity, faded into a distant memory. Her life was now governed by a new set of rhythms, a routine dictated by the needs of her small, self-contained world. The town had given her a name. She learned it from a trapper who passed by her land, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and suspicion at the sight of smoke curling from her stone chimney. "They're calling you the Stone Witch down in the valley," he'd said, not unkindly. "Say you're living in a hole in the ground like a badger." The name was meant to be an insult, a way to dismiss her, to cast her out not just physically, but socially. She felt a brief sting of anger, but it passed quickly. Let them talk. Their words could not penetrate stone. Elias came once. He rode up the trail on his fine horse, stopping a safe distance from her door. He did not dismount. He looked at the solid wall, the sturdy door, the wisp of smoke. He was looking for signs of failure, of starvation, of the desperate defeat he had predicted. He found none. He saw only a strange, formidable structure that seemed to have grown out of the hillside itself. Stone stood beside Ilara, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Still here, I see," Elias said, his voice tight with a strange mix of resentment and disbelief. "I am," Ilara replied, her voice calm. "Winter will be the real test," he said, more to himself than to her. He turned his horse and rode away, spreading the tale of his sister-in-law's bizarre folly, her witch's hole, confirming for everyone in Silver Creek that she was mad, doomed, or both. But as the first deep snows of winter arrived, Ilara's routine became a quiet, powerful rebuttal to their scorn. Each morning she would rise in the dim light that filtered through the two small glass-paned windows she had painstakingly set into the front wall. The air in the shelter was cool, but never cold. The massive stone walls held the previous day's fire and the earth's own warmth, creating a stable, comfortable temperature. Her first task was always the fire. She would add a few logs of the pine she had spent the autumn cutting and stacking against the outer wall. The fire was the heart of her home, providing light, heat for cooking, and a cheerful crackle that fought back the immense silence of the snow-covered wilderness. Next, she tended her animals. The two hens, whom she called Henny and Penny, lived in a small stone coop she had built against the warm inner wall of the fissure. They were healthy and plump, and their daily gift of 2 eggs felt like a miracle. She would feed them scraps and grain, their contented clucking a vital sound of life in the deep winter. Then came the garden. In the back of the dwelling, where the geothermal warmth was strongest, her hidden greenhouse thrived. Under the constant, gentle heat from the rock, her kale grew dark and hardy, her carrots swelled fat and orange beneath the soil, and her potatoes multiplied in the rich, dark earth. It was a patch of perpetual autumn, a secret summer hidden in the heart of a frozen mountain. The sight of green living things in the dead of winter was a source of profound, quiet pride. Her days were filled with the small, essential tasks of survival. She would check her water cistern, always full from the ceaseless drip. She would grind flour for bread, mend her clothes, check the snare lines she had set for rabbits in the sparse woods. She carved spoons from pieces of pine and wove a rug from dried grasses. Her world was small, but it was orderly, warm, and entirely her own. She was not just surviving, she was presiding over a tiny, functioning kingdom, of which she was the sole architect and sovereign. The winter threw its smaller tests at her. One night, a pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of the chickens, circled her home. Their howls were a terrifying, primal sound. Stone stood at the door, barking with a ferocity that belied his size, his hackles raised. Elara stood behind him, axe in hand, her heart pounding. But the thick wooden door and solid stone walls held. The wolves could find no purchase, no weakness. Eventually, they moved on, their howls fading into the distance. Her systems had worked. Another test came in the form of an early blizzard, a storm that blew in without warning and raged for 3 days. The wind shrieked and battered against her shelter, piling snow halfway up the door. Outside, the world was a white chaos. But inside, the fire burned steadily, the air was calm, and the only sound was the wind's fury, muffled and made harmless by the tons of rock that surrounded her. She had a full cistern of water, a garden full of food, and warm, dry animals. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. When the storm finally broke, she dug her way out into a world of blinding white and profound silence, her small home having proven itself a fortress against the worst the winter could offer. She was utterly alone, but for the first time in her life, she was not helpless. The end of winter was a liar. It came in a warm, deceptive wave in early March, a false spring that melted the snow and coaxed green shoots from the valley floor. The people of Silver Creek, weary of the long cold, embraced it with foolish relief. They plowed their fields and planted their crops early, eager for the promise of a bountiful harvest. They spoke of the mild end to the season as a blessing, a sign of good fortune to come. Elara, watching the snow recede from the higher slopes of the scab, felt no such optimism. The warmth felt thin, brittle. The air lacked the deep, earthy smell of a true spring. She kept her garden inside. The blessing revealed itself to be a curse in the second week of April. The sky, which had been a hopeful blue, turned the color of a dull pewter bruise. The temperature plummeted. It did not just get cold. The warmth was violently torn from the air. A wind rose, not the blustering wind of a winter storm, but a thin, silent, razor-sharp gale that carried a cold so deep it felt ancient and alien. They would later call it the Iron Frost. It was not a blizzard, there was no snow. It was a pure, crystalline freeze that descended like a judgment. The world outside Elara's shelter became a hostile, glittering planet. Every branch, every pine needle, every blade of grass was encased in a thick, clear sheath of ice. The sun shone on a world made of glass, a beautiful and terrible sight. The temperature dropped to levels no one in the valley had ever experienced, and stayed there, day after night, for a week, then 2. Inside her home, Elara felt the change. The air grew colder, and she had to keep the fire burning higher than usual. But her systems held. The immense thermal mass of the mountain resisted the predatory cold. The geothermal heat, that faint but constant pulse, fought back against the frost. Her water cistern did not freeze. Her chickens, nestled in their stone coop, huddled together but remained alive. And in the back of her dwelling, the secret garden, warmed by the very bones of the earth, was untouched. The kale stood green and proud. The carrots and potatoes were safe in their earthen beds. She was an island of warmth and life in an ocean of crystalline death. In Silver Creek, the catastrophe was absolute. The tender green shoots of wheat and corn in the fields were turned to blackened, frozen mush in a single night. The sap in the fruit trees froze solid, splitting their trunks with loud cracks that echoed like rifle shots in the unnaturally still air. The community's confidence shattered as quickly as the ice-coated branches. The iron frost was relentless. It seeped through the chinking of their log cabins. It found every crack, every draft. Families huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their winter woodpiles at a terrifying rate. The town's conventional structures, built for ordinary winters, were failing. Livestock, caught in barns that were little more than wooden shells, began to die. The lowing of freezing cattle was a constant, mournful sound in the valley. The river froze solid, cutting off the mill. Food stores, already low at the end of winter, became precious. The false spring had tricked them into vulnerability, and now the true winter had come to claim its due. Panic began to curdle into despair. Mr. Gable's mercantile was stripped bare of blankets and flour. The confidence of the town, their belief in their own rugged preparedness, had frozen and cracked, just like everything else. They were trapped, and they were beginning to starve. One night, deep into the third week of the freeze, Elara was awakened by a frantic, desperate barking from Stone. It was not his usual warning growl, it was a sound of alarm. She grabbed the heavy axe that always leaned by her door and listened. Over the dog's barking, she heard another sound, a faint, rhythmic banging on her door. It was a weak, exhausted sound, almost lost in the vast, frozen silence. Her heart hammered in her chest. No one ever came to the scab. No sane person would be out in this cold. With Stone growling by her side, she lifted the heavy bar from the door and pulled it open just a crack. A figure was slumped against the frame, a bundled shape dark against the glittering, moonlit ice. The figure slid downward, collapsing onto her doorstep in a heap of shawls and frozen cloth. It was a woman. As Elara knelt, pulling back a frosted hood, she saw the face of Mary, Elias's wife. Her skin was blue with cold, her lips cracked and pale. Her eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond the freeze. "Please," Mary gasped, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "Help me. It's my son."
"It's Thomas."
Elara pulled the freezing woman inside, dragging her away from the killing cold and shutting the heavy door, sealing them back into the warmth. She helped Mary to a stool by the fire, wrapping her in a thick wool blanket. Stone sniffed at the visitor, whining softly, his aggression vanishing in the face of such profound distress. Mary's hands trembled as she reached for the warmth of the fire. She looked around the small, warm room, her eyes darting from the glowing hearth to the impossible sight of the green garden in the back. Disbelief warred with desperation on her face. She was looking at a world that should not exist. "My boy," she sobbed, the words catching in her throat. "He has the lung fever. The doctor said he needs warmth, nourishing broth. But our cabin is so cold. We've burned nearly all our wood. The cold gets in everywhere. He's so weak, Elara. He's dying." Elara stood perfectly still, the axe still in her hand. This was the woman who had stood silently on her porch, while her husband, Elias, cast Elara out with a pittance and a worthless deed. This was the woman who had whispered with the others, who had pitied her, then mocked her. Now she was here, in the witch's hole, begging for the life of her child, the child of the man who had left Elara to die. A bitter, cold satisfaction flickered in Elara's heart. The memory of their scorn, of Elias's cruel words in the mercantile, was sharp and clear. She had what they needed. She had warmth. She had food. She had survived their judgment, and now they had come to her, broken. She could turn her away. She could send her back into the iron frost to face the consequences of her husband's cruelty. It would be justice. But then she looked at Mary's face, stripped of all pride, ravaged by fear for her child. She thought of young Thomas, a boy of 6, coughing his life away in a freezing cabin. The child was innocent. He had played no part in the sins of his father. What kind of justice demanded the price of a child's life? The moral choice was stark, as clear as the ice outside. She could be the person they had made her out to be, a bitter, isolated witch, hoarding her survival. Or she could be the person she had become, a woman who had built life out of nothing, a woman strong enough to be merciful. The battle in her soul lasted only a moment. Her own carefully rationed stores, her precious woodpile, the eggs that were her lifeline, all of it was at risk. But a life was at stake. She leaned the axe against the wall. The decision was made. "There is no broth here," she said, her voice quiet but firm, startling Mary from her grief. "But we will make some." She moved with purpose. She took one of her precious eggs from a small wooden bowl. She went to her indoor garden and, with a small knife, cut a handful of dark green kale. She opened a small wooden chest and took out a piece of salted rabbit she had snared weeks ago. She handed the ingredients to Mary, whose hands were still shaking. "Take these," Elara commanded gently. "Go home. Boil the meat in water for as long as you can. Then add the greens. When he can eat, give him the egg. It will give him strength." Then she did something more. She went to her woodpile, the meticulously stacked fuel that was the difference between her own life and death, and began loading logs into a canvas sack. It was a significant portion of her supply, a terrible risk to take with the freeze showing no sign of ending. "And take this," she said, hefting the heavy sack. "Burn it hot. Keep the fire high until morning." She walked to the door, opened it, and faced the lethal, glittering cold. "I will follow you in an hour. I will bring more." It was a promise to venture out into the frozen hellscape, to risk her own safety for the family that had scorned her. She was not just giving them charity, she was joining their fight. When Elias arrived an hour later to fetch his wife and the supplies, he found Elara preparing to leave, bundled in every layer she owned, a small sled loaded with more firewood and a covered basket at her feet. He stopped in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and shame. The warmth of the shelter hit him like a physical blow. It was a deep, steady warmth, utterly alien in the frozen world. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom of his own drafty cabin, struggled to adjust. Then he saw it. Past Elara, in the back of the dwelling, was the garden. It was lit by the soft glow of the fire, a patch of impossible, vibrant green. Living plants. He saw the chickens nestled in their coop, alive and calm. He smelled the scent of earth, of wood smoke, of life. He stared, speechless. The stories, the mockery, the derisive nickname of Stone Witch, it all crumbled to dust in the face of this reality. This was not a hole. It was a sanctuary. He looked from the thriving garden to Elara's face, weathered and resolute. He saw her scarred hands. He saw the quiet strength in her eyes, a strength he had mistaken for madness. He thought of the worthless deed he had given her, the barren rock he had sent her to as a cruel joke. He had cast her out to die, and in this dead place she had built a world more alive than the one he had left. The arrogance and pride that had defined him collapsed. All that was left was a raw, aching humility. He took a staggering step inside, his gaze sweeping over the ordered, ingenious systems of her home, the water cistern, the neatly stacked supplies, the solid, warm walls. "I was wrong, Elara," he said, the words torn from him, low and hoarse. He could not meet her eyes. He stared at the stone floor. I was a fool, a cruel fool. We called you mad." "My God, we were the ones who were mad." His voice broke. "I drove you out to this place to be rid of you, and you have built this." Elara listened, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her face, no hint of, "I told you so." The moment of his confession, which she might once have dreamed of, felt hollow in the face of the real crisis at hand. His apology could not warm his dying son. She simply nodded, accepting the words without comment. Her grace was more cutting than any accusation she could have leveled. It left him with nothing but the full weight of his own shame. She picked up the basket from the floor. Inside, nestled in cloth, were 2 more eggs, a bundle of carrots, and half a loaf of the dense, hearty bread she baked. "This is not about you or me anymore, Elias," she said, her voice devoid of bitterness. It was the voice of pure, pragmatic necessity. "It is about the child." She looked past him, out into the lethal, frozen night. "Your cabin cannot hold the heat. The cold is too deep. The firewood will only last so long." She looked back at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. She made the offer that would forever change their lives and the future of Silver Creek. "The child needs warmth, real warmth that does not fail. Bring him here." She gestured to the small space, to her own bed of pine boughs and blankets near the hearth. "There is room. Bring him now." She was not just offering him food, she was offering her home. She was offering the one thing his family had denied her, shelter from the storm. Her forgiveness was not a speech, it was an action. It was the opening of a door. It was a seat by the fire. It was the quiet, unassailable proof of a character forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of injustice and labor. And in that moment, Elias knew he was standing in the presence of a strength he had never imagined. The freeze broke 4 days after Elias brought his son to Alara's shelter. The boy, Thomas, wrapped in blankets by the constant warmth of her fire and nourished by the simple, life-giving food from her garden, had survived. His fever broke on the 3rd night, his breathing easing in the warm, stable air. When the temperature finally began to climb, melting the world of glass back into a landscape of mud and ruin, the story of what had happened on the scab began to spread through Silver Creek. It was Elias who told it first. Humbled and transformed, he described the impossible warmth, the green garden growing in the heart of the mountain, and the quiet, unhesitating grace of the woman he had cast out. People, desperate and grieving their losses, did not believe it at first. But as more families, their own food stores gone, made the difficult trek up the hill, they returned with the same story. They came seeking a handout and left with an egg, a few potatoes, and a profound sense of awe. Ilara shared what little surplus she had, saving the most desperate, especially the children, from starvation. Her home became a beacon. The derisive nickname, Stone Witch, was never spoken again. The land, once called the Scab, was now referred to with a new reverence: Widow's Hearth. Her shelter was no longer a place of exile, but the heart of the community's survival. The authority figures who had dismissed her, like Mr. Gable, now looked at her with a deep, abiding respect. Their own wisdom had failed. Their sturdy log buildings had cracked. Their preparations had been useless. The foolish girl in the cave had been the only one who was truly prepared. In the weeks that followed, as the full extent of the devastation became clear, the lost livestock, the failed crops that guaranteed a hungry year ahead, the people of Silver Creek did not come to Alara for more food. They came for knowledge. They came to learn. Men who had once laughed at her stood in silence as she showed them how she had mortared her stones, how she had vented her fire through a natural fissure, how the earth itself could be a blanket against the cold. Women who had whispered gossip about her now asked her how to grow things in darkness, how to find the clay, how to build a coop that would keep animals alive through the deepest freeze. The town of Silver Creek did not simply recover, it rebuilt itself differently. New barns were raised with thick stone foundations dug into the hillsides. Root cellars were deepened and insulated, not just with straw, but with clay and rock. People began to look at the landscape not as something to be conquered, but as something to partner with. They learned from Elada that the greatest shelter was not the one that fought the wilderness, but the one that understood it. Elias, using his influence and his own savings, ensured that Elada never wanted for anything again, bringing her tools, seeds, and supplies not as charity, but as a long overdue debt being paid. Her story traveled. Trappers and merchants carried the tale of the Iron Frost of '83 and the widow who survived it to other towns and settlements. The legend of the woman who built a greenhouse inside a mountain became a new kind of frontier tale, not one of conquest with a rifle, but of survival with wisdom and an axe. Her methods were adopted by others, and the simple, powerful principles of her design changed the way people built their homes in those harsh northern territories. The landscape itself began to change, dotted with structures that were smarter, stronger, and more deeply connected to the earth. Years later, Elara stood at the door of her home. It was no longer a simple shelter, but had been expanded, with a small, sturdy barn built against its western wall and a larger terraced garden flourishing on the sunnier slope below. She was no longer an outcast, but the quiet, respected matriarch of the valley. Young Thomas, the boy she had saved, was now a young man who visited her weekly, bringing her goods from town and helping with the heavy chores. The community she had been cast out of had, in the end, reformed itself around her. She looked out over Silver Creek, watching the smoke rise from the chimneys of homes built with stone and wisdom. She had been stripped of everything: her husband, her home, her name. They had left her with nothing but a barren rock and their scorn. But on that rock, she had built not just a shelter, but a life. She had discovered that true wealth was not measured in coins or property, but in resilience. And she had learned that the greatest strength was not found in holding a grudge, but in the quiet, moral courage to offer warmth to the very people who had cast you out into the cold. The setting sun bathed the valley in a soft, golden light, and Elara, the woman who had been left with nothing, felt a profound and lasting peace. She was home.